Uh, Good morning. It's a great privilege to be here on behalf of the Global Commission to share with you the work that we've done over the last year, trying to understand the relationship between economic growth and climate action. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to do just a couple of things. I'm going to share with you what the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate was all about. I'm going to describe the main findings of our work, and then I intend to try and translate some of those broad findings into some implications for Norway. And everyone looks at Norway. It's a huge opportunity for the country, but there is also a responsibility that sits with the role that you actually do play in the international system. So very briefly, we set up the Commission roughly 20 months ago. In September 2013, we had 7 commissioning countries, of which Norway was one. There were 8 partner research institutes from all over the world. This was not something that was just based in the OECD. This was deliberately designed to have a strong global feel to it. Our commission was headed by Felipe Calderon. Your former Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg was one of the commissioners. But we had a tremendous mix of 5 former heads of state, 5 CEOs, the heads of the OECD and the International Energy Agency, and the deputy heads of the World Bank and the IMF. So we had an astonishing cast of the great and good, if you will, on the Commission, and an advisory panel including Nobel Prize-winning laureates. So we had a fantastic, if you will, set of stakeholders that were helping us shape the work. Our core question was very straightforward, which was to understand the relationship between economic growth on the one hand and taking strong climate action on the other. For most people in if you will, economic decision-making circles, both public and private, their mental model is that those 2 agendas, those 2 goals of economic growth and climate action are in conflict. We should not be under any illusion. That is how most of the world thinks. And actually, if you get down into the technicalities of economic modeling, that's how most economic models operate. They perfectly clear, and then you impose a constraint called a carbon budget, and that requires a cost. So our job was to look around the world and look at the economic theory and the evidence and really understand that relationship between economic growth and climate action. And the second thing was to distill a whole set of lessons for decision makers from what we learnt in our travels. And the reality is that people's mental model about, for example, renewable energy is still stuck 5-10 years out of date. It's expensive, it's low quality, it's intermittent, it's not reliable. People's mental models are 5 to 10 years out of date. And so our job was to make sure that all the evidence was put together in a practical way that could enable policy and decision makers to improve the quality of what they do. We always start with the question of economic growth. One of the things that is abundantly clear, I want to step out from behind the podium if that's okay, is that the world isn't operating on some mythical business as usual model. Right? Everyone likes in the environment and climate conversations to talk about business as usual. But what we see across the world is that economies are going through massive structural change. And it's needed here in Europe, given the flatlining of the economy. It's needed in the States, where even though there is more economic growth, it's deeply unequal. And of course, from the perspective of the economy and climate conversation, what goes on in China is absolutely fundamental. And in the work that we did in China, what's abundantly clear is that their economic growth model, and the decision makers in China would agree with this, has been geared towards capital and energy and pollution-intensive industrialization. And that took them from being a low-income to a middle-income country, but it's not going to take them from being a middle to a high-income country. And all the analysis of how you think about economic growth and climate in China tells you that the economic restructuring towards a more service-based economy is what will drive that economy towards lower emissions. 2/3 of emissions improvement come from economic restructuring, and only 1/3 from changes in the fuel mix. So we'll start all our conversations. We were the Global Commission on the Economy, how to build better economy, and climate. And our lesson, and one of the things I think you all know, but I will share with you, is that starting with the economy and what is on the minds of decision makers is a good place to start this conversation. Starting with climate typically does not land as effectively. We were the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, however, so we do focus much of our work trying to understand where does better economic performance and strong climate action come together. And in all our work, we focus not on the next 100 year, we don't focus on 2100. I don't know what the global economy is going to look like in 2100 and the technologies that will be available, and I actually struggle to know what it's going to be like in 2030. I think there is an enormous pace of change, and so our focus is really on the next 15 years. And what we say in our work is that the next 15 years are critical. And they're critical because they provide an opportunity. We do have a window to get from the, if you will, the red line, which takes us off into absolutely uncharted and terrifying territory in terms of climate instability, and getting somewhere onto between the green and the blue line. And to be honest, in our work, we were not overly rigid about exactly hitting 450 parts per million or 432. We operated on the basis that what we need to do is to get onto a lower carbon pathway that can trend towards zero emissions in the second half of the century. But what we need to do is set the platforms up and the technology drivers and the market mechanisms to create fundamental tipping points. We want to use the dynamics of the system and not look at the world in static terms. So that was our framing. Because of that, focused most of our work on this very simple kind of architecture. We looked at how to build better cities, how to use land in a dramatically better way, how to improve the performance of energy systems. At every step of the journey, our question was, how do you improve economic performance and deliver climate benefits at the same time? And in order to achieve the what you need to do systematically, and this is what good economic theory teaches us, is you need to drive resource efficiency. You need to improve the quality of investment in infrastructure, and we, it's not just us that says this. Read the latest IMF reports, and they talk about, in today's environment with low interest rates, with relatively slack resources, that the benefits of infrastructure investment are not just short-term demand management, not just Keynesian economics, but they can transform the productivity of economies over multiple years. And then we look deeply at the question of innovation, because of course, in the end, we can get so far with the technologies that we have, but to drive the transformation of energy systems and urban and transport and land use and industrial systems over time, we will need new technologies. And that is not just individual component technologies, that is technology systems, how they come together, hardware and software, and the institutional arrangements around them. So our approach to all of this was to think through how to combine these elements into stories about better economic growth. And I was in Ethiopia just over the weekend, and this is their story. They want a story in which they're a very exposed country in terms of climate risk. They're one of the poorest countries in the world, as you know, still only at $600 per capita. Hard for anyone, that's probably what people earn in a week or less than people earn in a week here. So $600 per capita. This is their story. This is what the cabinet of Ethiopia wants to talk about. How do we drive a better form of urbanization? How do we take advantage of the potential for dramatic improvements in the way we use land? Clean energy, where they have immense hydro and wind and solar and geothermal resources. Could they be, if you will, a clean energy manufacturing hub for East Africa? So this is their story, not mine. When we look at what it will take to build the kind of cities, more compact cities, right, that in fact have less congestion, less air pollution, higher standards of living because of the well-being that it generates through being more connected and having greater proximity to social services. when we look at what it takes to invest in those cities and energy systems and land use systems, what we see is that the real investment requirements between going low carbon and building the right infrastructure over the next 15 years or going high carbon, they're more or less the same number. All right? And so one thing I'd want you to walk away from my comments is that over the next 15 years, we will invest one way or another across the world about $90 trillion in infrastructure. And that's about $6 trillion a year. And we have a choice, right? And we can either invest it well, in which case we create the biggest possible flywheel for a transition to a low-carbon economy, or we invest it poorly, as a consequence of which we will end up locked into the wrong kind of economic strategy. But one thing that we do believe profoundly as the Global Commission is that there is no substantial additional investment requirement. Right, so those people that tell you this will cost the Earth are blowing smoke, and we should push them back and really challenge hard on that. And our numbers, by the way, which we developed independently, are very, very similar to numbers coming out of the International Energy Agency. So it's not as if we're standing on our own on this point. I'm going to just do 2 or 3 last slides and then stop, because I'm conscious that this is, we want to have a conversation, not just a presentation. We tried to understand how the actions around cities, land use and energy and the investments that I've described translated into reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And we care deeply about tackling this problem. And essentially, globally, we emit today about 50 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, so the full set of greenhouse gas emissions. And there is a significant proportion from land use, so let's always keep that in mind. If you play it out over 15 years and you think that the world economy could kind of, if you will, is growing in a sort of linear fashion, that number goes from 50 to 68, so we basically increased by a gigaton a year. I mean, actually, for me, it helps that the maths are simple. We then looked at those actions and investments that you could take across the world that, even aside from climate, forget the benefits of taking action on climate, but just in terms of good common sense economics, improved resource efficiency, reduced air quality problems, better transport systems with higher productivity. What is it that you would choose to do anyway, even if there was no climate change? And what you would say is that, that there's huge progress we can make on cities by driving to more compact cities and better transport systems. Huge improvements on land use, huge improvements around the energy system as we diversify away from coal because of the air quality and the energy security issues and water security issues around coal. And that leaves us most of the way to, not all the way to climate safety, but most of the way. And what we would say is that there then are investments that are required in pure climate risk management, including CCS, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, and including even more investment in forestry than we might do in terms of just, if you will, the narrow economic benefits. Last couple of slides. I wanted to translate this into the implications for Norway. We do see a huge opportunity for Norway. That there are assets here that are absolutely immense. So clearly you have, as you know, have huge hydro and wind capacity locally, but there's a potential to play it out globally. You have very substantial financial resources here in Norway, not least through the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and there are real choices about the nature of the investment strategies, and I'm absolutely conscious that those investment strategies need to be geared to the long-term interests and, if you will, financial security of this country. But it seems to me that at least thinking through the integrated balance sheet of Norway, such that as you think about the investments of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, you're hedging the fact that as an economy, in any event, you have very substantial hydrocarbon assets. So why buy more of them through the Sovereign Wealth Fund? So there are huge opportunities that we would see. And just to close, the one thing that I would emphasize is that in order to take advantage of these assets, there are 2 things that matter. One is timing, and it is our view that, that the time to act is now. Right? We have had an amazing run-up of resource prices, and Norway as an economy has had an immense benefit of windfall gains, and so this is the time to act. If there's ever a time to act strategically and to think through what an evolution of the economy could look like over the next 25 to 30 years, it's to start now. Don't wait 10, 15 years for the world to have changed again and for Norway to be potentially less well-positioned than you are today. So getting it right now and thinking through what the 25, 30-year evolution looks like is critical. And then the other piece that's absolutely key is to make sure that enough of your young talent, the engineering talent in this country, and the broad software talent, the young talent of this country, is attracted into a broad, diversified set of activities, and in particular, into what we see as the clean energy and the new climate economy sectors of the economy. The smart cities, the smart transport, the smart energy. Let's get them in there and not see them all, if you will, or disproportionately absorbed into what is the current industrial ecology of the country, which is very heavily geared towards hydrocarbons. So huge opportunity, but some real change and some deep action, not just at the level of policy, but fundamental shifts in how the talent of this country decides to commit. Thank you very much indeed.